Philosophers say that there are 6 philosophies of race, 3 that speak to what a person thinks race is, and 3 that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race. And each of us holds 2 philosophies, even without having the proper philosophical language to say, this is my philosophy. Of the first 3 categories, there's something called naturalism, which means that you think race is biological, it's in nature. This has been, of course, disproven, though you have some scientists still holding onto the concept of race as biological. Then you have something called constructionism, which is the default position in our society, where, like gender, people will say race is a social construction. They might concede the point that race is not in nature, but they still say that because of how racism operates itself, race is rendered real in a socially constructed way. And then the third category that speaks to what a person thinks race is something called skepticism. Skeptics argue that because race is not in nature, it's not real. I'm a skeptic. My skepticism takes me further than that. I see all of us as ultimately being raceless because race is not biological. Okay, check. I believe the science. I believe modern scientists when they say it's not biological. Race as a social construction, I argue that what people perceive as race or racial, they're misnaming other things. They're misnaming ethnicity, which of course includes ancestry, it includes DNA, it includes culture. They're misnaming class. So Blackness gets conflated with poverty almost incessantly, or they're misnaming racism itself, which often camouflages itself as race and gets interpreted as race. And so as a skeptic myself, I say that race is not real in any way. Racism is real. Regarding the philosophies that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race, you have conservationism, which is, as it sounds, conservationists want to keep the concept of race. Probably they're naturalists because you can't do anything else with nature after all. Then you have Reconstructionism, which is the default position in American society. So Reconstructionists tend to be constructionists, and for whatever variety of reasons, they're trying to reconstruct what race is. Jim Crow, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, those are all Reconstructionist efforts, which is part of my evidence that Reconstruction has taken us as far as it can. And then the last category, which is where I sit, is something called eliminativism. Eliminativists argue that the concept of race should be eliminated. So theory of racelessness speaks to the skepticism in that we're already raceless. It's a radical act of recognizing our racelessness and stop conflating racelessness with whiteness, because that's how so-called white people continue to be perceived to be free from the negative effects of racism. And that's part of the machinery that keeps racism upheld. And also racelessness, it's an aspiration because I recognize that most of our society believes in the fiction and treats it like it's real and doesn't see that there is an alternative way.
Yeah, that was an excellent explanation.
We live in a society where we have vision, we can see people's phenotype, we translate that into race, and where there are differences, we translate that into racism. And as proof positive of racism, we translate that into racism being omnipresent and global and worldwide. And when how you see a problem is going to ultimately impact how you solve or treat or don't solve the problem. And in some ways, you know, critical race theory proper, when you have Derek Bell saying that racism is inescapable and inevitable, in some ways, I'm like, yes, bias is inevitable. Probably there's it, because every society has some amount of biases and we teach it to our children and we just pass it on and we stay in the cycle. But it's my sincere belief that racism needn't be one of the things that's inescapable or inevitable. And this requires, instead of continuing to teach race in the ways that we do, and by extension teaching racism, this requires us adults, enough adults getting it together enough, seeing the light to teach young people a different way. And the different way, as part of our strategy, is encouraging and inviting people to view themselves as deracialized, as raceless, so that we can do the analytical work to see how race operates, what's happening with race, how does it really function, and become more clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't. And if we're more clear-eyed about what it is, because we're not seeing ourselves from within the box or within the fishbowl, we're outside of the fishbowl, if you will, then we are better able to, number one, stop unintentionally upholding the problem of racism, which comes through the upholding of the belief in race. But number two, because race is often talked about in white and black terms, we are better able to stop seeing the world in such black and white ways, which leads to recognizing our shared Americanness in ways that, when we stop racializing Americanness and hyphenating everyone else who's not racialized as white, for example, then we can embrace truly the complexity of ourselves, the fact that we are all individuals and we're part of a collective. We all have mobility, we all have personal agency. We can recognize the progress that's made against racism and recognize where opportunities still exist. We can, but it's like, as long as we stay in the black and white mindset, we really are precluded, more people than not are precluded from seeing themselves in these far more fruitful and interconnected ways. People who would never admit racism was real because they were racialized as white and from their perspectives, pigeonholed, find a place with theory of racelessness because they can do it and not be burdened with the shame and the guilt that's expected of them and the self-flagellation and all the things. Our reconstructionary efforts, our attempts to be colorblind, all of those things, I think, have taken us as far as they can.
Yeah, I see a lot to agree with and want to amplify in theory of racelessness. And I'm struck by your point of race being conflated with class, I think, or with privilege or with disadvantage in a subtle and sometimes subconscious way. A good friend of mine, Jesse Single, who's usually very careful with this kind of stuff, tweeted some data indicating that the percentage of poor students in the Ivy Leagues hasn't changed in 50 or 60 years. You wouldn't necessarily predict it because the percentage of kids of color has gone up so drastically in the Ivy Leagues by design, justified by policies that are supposed to be correcting for disadvantage, helping the disadvantaged, and so forth. So you might guess, well, I'm assuming the past 60 years of affirmative action, okay, let's say 50 years of affirmative action, have had some effect on the percentage of poor kids that go to our best colleges. And the fact that it hasn't, and that I think most people would assume that it has, sort of by proxy, people are lazily conflating, oh, well, we're getting more Black kids here, we're getting more Hispanic kids. Well, we must be doing good in the world by picking up kids that come from more disadvantage. So we don't even need to pay attention to something like class, because we're basically doing that anyway by paying attention to race. Many people who support affirmative action would assume that they are, quote, helping the poor by doing so, without even checking, because of how closely people associate those concepts. It's clear to me that the notion of race in our history has done so much more harm than good. The idea of race has done and is doing more harm than good. Whether you think it's real or not, I think it is harming our society more than it's helping it. And that's been true for a long time. And it's true today. And that's not, I don't think that's true of all the concepts that we use to divvy people up. I don't think it's true of biological sex, for instance. I don't think it's true of culture. I don't think that's, I think the concept of race is especially and uniquely harmful. And allowing the government the power to act based on race has historically and continues to be harmful. Teaching our kids to view race as a real thing, even if we're just teaching that it's a social construct that matters. I think all of this is doing more harm than good. And I think that's I mean, it's obvious to me just by reading the news every day, by living my life. But I think the less we care about this, the less we view this as real, the healthier our society will become. And that requires fighting not only actual white supremacy and anti-Black racism of the kind that still certainly exists. It requires fighting the racial essentialism on the cultural left. But hopefully you and I can be part of the solution to that.
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of the walking that line in not the best ways, I think a lot of that is stemming from the fact that alternatives either haven't existed or just haven't been widely known. Right? The good news is who you are remains, because who you are has nothing to do with what you think is race, right? What people see as race or racial, they're misnaming ethnicity, which exists. They're misnaming culture, which exists. They're misnaming class, or they're misnaming racism hiding itself as race. All I'm talking about doing and eliminating is the racism. That's it. I'm not talking about the stuff you love about yourself.